For a long time, Mario platforming games were known to include a functioning multiplayer mode. Granted, it usually boiled down to the game having both players take turns to play as either Mario or Luigi, but by Super Mario 64, things changed. A few times prior, we've explored how Super Mario 64 was going to have a multiplayer mode with even a Luigi model found, but it was dropped due to a memory issue of both being on screen at once. But then we hit the next generation with the Nintendo GameCube, where memory issues weren't as big of a problem, and so one would think this time in Super Mario Sunshine it'd appear, right? Well, that turned out to be a no. But what if I said this also wasn't the case, and that in fact within the data are remnants of such a mode that can be activated to an extent and even restored? As such, today on Cut Content, we'll be looking at the cut multiplayer function of Super Mario Sunshine. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button, hit the like button too to further support us and keep creating new videos. Now, the existence of this beta multiplayer function can of course all be found within the data of the game in plain sight, within several leftover functions that plainly list out the multiplayer in the data. Which of course there is one for map data, 3 for cameras, 3 for characters, and 1 for general multiplayer data. Now thankfully, simply popping in this action replay code seems to get it to function. On first inspection, it looks as if nothing has changed, but notice that the camera is a lot closer, and the game won't even allow me to zoom out at all. As well, it seems I can't even switch to aiming flood. Before trying to figure out why this is the case, let's look at the second camera function. If you go into a map that contains Shadow Mario, well, it's ridiculously zoomed out. The closer you get to Shadow Mario, the closer the camera gets. The further out you go, the further the camera zooms out too. So to anyone who has played multiplayer games without a split screen, you will be familiar with this concept of the map changing distance depending on how close the players are together. In this case, the game seems to think of Shadow Mario as the second player, and with good reason at that. Now, there are a few theories I have around all this. The first and obvious one is that Shadow Mario wasn't going to be a second playable character in a co-op fashion, as that just wouldn't make any sense from a story perspective of this game. What makes more sense is that this could have been for a separate multiplayer mode, whereby you go up against someone who controls Mario or Shadow Mario and do a task to win. What that activity was is hard to say, but could be the usual capture the flag situation, or shine in this case, or better yet, maybe even a Splatoon kind of situation of dirt versus clean, whereby as Shadow Mario, you try to make the level more dirty while regular Mario tries to clean. In fact, what's interesting is that there is one hidden mechanic left, whereby as Mario or Shadow Mario, you can grab the other in this multiplayer mode and toss him. Doesn't point to exactly what this multiplayer mode was, but if it was that hypothetical game of pre-Splatoon, then I can see the idea of tossing them away so you can clean up or dirty up an area. Now, what needs to be understood is that the actual playable Shadow Mario isn't actually in the data, and that any mods that have attempted this simply have been modding in Shadow Mario's actor model with a duplicate player actor, which is why you have them acting like Mario. But even so, the multiplayer function detects Shadow Mario based off his actor model rather than the actual player code, and thus why we have the camera acting up like this. So if the Shadow Mario zoom out multiplayer map appears to be a cut function, what was the super zoomed in camera then? Well, simply that without Shadow Mario being there, it defaults to a completely zoomed in Mario. In fact, if Shadow Mario despawns, that is exactly what happens. Now, the oddity in all this is, why so zoomed out? Why not a split screen mode? Even Luigi's Mansion's cut multiplayer mode had a split screen mode when they moved out far enough. And my theory goes that while this camera does literally work on every map, it isn't intended for any of these existing maps. I mean, look at how badly it clips through everything. Realistically, it may have been for specifically designed multiplayer maps that were smaller in size and meant not to have geometry that would obscure too hard. Alternatively, there could have been additional cameras made for the multiplayer mode that didn't make it into the data of the final game, like a split screen mode. I mean, no matter how you look at it, without split screen, it just wouldn't work properly, considering how important elevation is in a platformer, and how a top-down view doesn't let you see that very well. I mean, if they were testing out multiplayer, there likely was a functional Shadow Mario there too to play as at one point that was removed from the data. As such, while the zoomed out camera may be a default here, I can imagine this being what a split screen would have looked like. Gives enough room to see, can't actually move the camera, but each player would have that very camera behind them. And if it functions anything like Luigi Mansion's cut multiplayer, which by the way was made by the very same team that made Mario Sunshine, they might have brought back the idea of, if close, the split screen would switch to a close overall camera like this, where you can still see just enough. So with that theory of how multiplayer may have functioned, I'm sure some of you are curious if Luigi would have been playable here. Well, as far as the data is concerned, there is absolutely zero trace of Luigi in here. Now, that's not to say it is absolutely impossible for them not to have brought him in at one point as a third playable character, considering the GameCube can run 4-player multiplayer at once. Maybe a Shadow Luigi too to do a sort of team battle in multiplayer mode. Heck, Luigi being in it could even have made a team co-op possible too. This together with how Shigeru Miyamoto was making Super Mario 64 2 as a game that would include both a playable Yoshi and Luigi. And well, Yoshi was playable here, but not Luigi. But alas, this is all conjecture here after all, and there is actually no evidence for Luigi ever being planned here. So now the big question is, why was this multiplayer mode removed in the end? Well, back when the GameCube came out, it was very clear to Nintendo early on that it was not catching on at all. It had some solid games at launch, especially Super Smash Bros. Melee, but everyone and their mothers, sometimes literally for a DVD player, wanted the PS2 instead. So as such, Nintendo wanted to rush out its mega hitters to the market to drive sales. Therefore, games like The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker and Super Mario Sunshine had their developments cut short in order to get them out to the market sooner, meaning something had to be cut. For Wind Waker, we know at least 2 dungeons were cut, while for Super Mario Sunshine, one of these may have very well been this multiplayer mode. Multiplayer usually was an afterthought to most developers back then, and so if needing to rush to a market, it would likely get cut. Unlike Mario 64, which had a memory issue, this game could function just fine in multiplayer if needed. Instead, this time it may have been just cause of rushed development. While Super Mario Sunshine has a beloved single-player mode, its multiplayer mode has been one that many have wondered about and went as far as to mod back in to an extent, where one can play as Shadow Mario, or even a 4-player online co-op game. But even so, 3D Mario games kept trying to incorporate this feature in the future, with Super Mario 3D World at last successfully bringing it in a 4-player co-op multiplayer to amazing results. And while it is hard to say what Sunshine's multiplayer was, it is always possible that the very idea we theorize today may have even been used later for Splatoon, as it is the same team that made that game down the line, which to many, the allusions between both games are very apparent. But of course that's a stretch, but doesn't stop us from thinking of the wild possibilities this mode could have offered. And Super Mario Sunshine is full of these leftover bits, whether it's cut enemies, objects, or even maps, all of which I plan to cover soon. So hit the subscribe button, for I'll plan to be back with more Mario and other games cut content soon. Hit the like button and comment below on what you think the multiplayer mode of Mario Sunshine was. So everyone, thank you for watching.